Now we take you to this year's annual convention of the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee. Speaking at Sunday's luncheon session was author and literature professor Edward Said, who talked about the future of Arab Americans. His remarks are 1 hour.
Let me start from the right to introduce the head table. Let me start with the left, because that is the trend that is going from left to right. Adnan Mourani, a doctor from Cleveland, a member of the board for a very long time, who has sustained the commitment of the Cleveland and Ohio community to the objectives and purposes of the ADC. On my immediate right, on your left, is Abu Wadia, a very distinguished scholar, which I will introduce later on. Next to him is Adnan Mourani. Ray Irani. Ray Irani. Mazen, oh my gosh, oh my God. Well, Mazen, you are supposed to tell him that I had a Freudian slip, which is a financial dimension of it. Mazen Irani is one of the most outspoken members of the board of the ADC. He has enriched its discourse for many years, and his commitment is unwavering, and I would like everybody to express their appreciation for the effort that he has made. And then, well, I don't want to say finally, but Naila Asali, the chairperson of the board, you know, I have to be politically correct. The chairperson of the board has steered this organization beyond the expectation of the optimists. And therefore, I would like all of us, towards the end of this convention, to give Naila Asali and the members of the board the applause and the ovation they deserve. While my name is Clovis Maqsood, allow me, and I know I will get a beating later on, to express also my great appreciation and admiration for the work of the president of ADC, Hala Maqsood. Needless to say that the members of the National Office of ADC have done a yeoman work. This convention would not have been possible was it not for their commitment, dedication, and clarity of purpose. So the staff of the ADC, stand up. Where are they? Staff. I'm going to take exactly 1 minute to say that last year's speech was far better delivered by Najla Edward Said than what we are going to listen today. Edward Said is the pride not only of the Palestinian community, but of the Arab community and what he calls the constituency of conscience throughout the world. May I introduce Dr. Edward Said.
Thank you very much. Thank you. No, sit down, please. You're not talking to George. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, ladies and gentlemen. Can you hear me all right? Let's see. I'd like to thank the organizers and officers of the ADC for inviting me in spite of my non-appearance last year. I think my daughter Najla's performance, as Clovis says, will far eclipse anything I'll ever do. But you're very patient, and I'm deeply grateful for the honor you've bestowed on us for having us here, Najla last year and me this year. I'm also grateful to Clovis, who is always such a good friend and selfless in his support of his friends and causes in which he believes. There are very few people like him in the Arab world, or out of it for that matter. So I think everybody recognizes his superb human qualities. I'm also pleased, having been, as many of you here have been, one of the people who was involved with ADC at the start, to see how much ADC has done in the last 15 or 20 years of its existence. Not only because it's by far the largest Arab American organization, but also because, much more important, it has gone further than any group before in creating a kind of community identity for the Arab Americans and giving them a kind of presence in the society which we've never had, for all kinds of reasons. We come from many different parts of the Arab world. There are all sorts of things that separate us. We've come at different times, different backgrounds, different interests and associations. But I think the presence of ADC as a protector of Arabs against stereotyping and attacks of one sort or another, and the beginning to create a positive identity is truly a tremendous thing. And I think it's very important that we recognize how far we've gone. We're great at recognizing, and I am too, at how little we've done. But I think it's important at moments like this to recognize that we've done a lot, and we've accomplished a great deal, and that's something that we should feel positive about. Now, the topic that I was given by Hala was the Arab American agenda, or an agenda for the future, political and active, which is, of course, much too big a subject for me possibly to deal with. So I'm going to talk about it in a very partial way, offering what I can, building on personal experience, because I think in the end that's the most valid. And then I'll try to generalize here and there, but I hope also that we'll have time for discussion and questions after I've finished. Now, one of the things that should be noted at the outset is that this is a very particular time in the history of the modern world. It's not only the end of a century and the millennium, but it's for the first time a world that is increasingly, I won't say dominated, but it's certainly increasingly influenced by expatriate and diaspora communities. I mean, if you think that today, for instance, Sweden, which is certainly the most Swedish country in the world, now has a population of over 15% non-Swedes. So this presence in many of what used to be extremely homogeneous countries like France and Britain and elsewhere in Western Europe, but also in Australia and other countries, Latin America, you recognize the presence there of large numbers of people from other parts of the world. And of course, this is nowhere more true than it is in the United States, which is, of course, an immigrant society, a society made up of immigrants. And in that panorama, of course, the Arabs have a very particular place. This is a multicultural society, and I think one of the things that ADC has pioneered is the role of the Arab Americans and their culture in a multicultural society, which is not only that of the white WASPs, but also of Latinos, of African Americans, Chinese, Asian Americans, and so on and so forth. So that's a very important thing to note, that we are playing a role in this diverse and extremely mobile world. It's a world of tremendous dynamic change. For the first time in history, the national bases of states is changing and taking on the identities of many new components in them. In England, for example, the Caribbean and the East Asian communities have changed Britain from a country largely dominated by white people to something quite different. The mix is very important, I think. Now, the peculiar situation of this country, I think, is even more recognized, because when I came here in the early 50s as a student, the idea was that you studied, let's say, the humanities, and that was automatically understood without any question to be the Western humanities. You read Shakespeare, you read Dante, you read Dostoevsky, you read Milton, and so on and so forth. In the almost 40 years that I've been teaching, the whole idea of the humanities has changed to a multicultural one, where the humanities are considered to be the province of the entire world. So students today, instead of just reading, although they were important things to read, Plato, Aristotle, Homer, Virgil, etc., now read the Quran, they read the great books of the Confucian tradition, they read the Japanese tradition, they read the Indian tradition, all in keeping with the fact that the recognition of multiculturalism in the United States has become a fact. And I think this is a new opportunity for us to assert our presence in this new mix. And I want to talk about that in a minute. What gives our situation as Arab Americans a particular, let's say, twist or tension is the fact that alone of all the regions of the world, there is a kind of political tension between the United States, the dominant, or at least the home society in which all of us live, and the part of the world from which we come. It's not entirely coincidental that, as we speak today, the United States is still bombing Iraq on an average of once every 3 days, that sanctions against several countries, several Arab countries, Middle Eastern countries, economic sanctions against them are maintained by the United States, that the sense most of us feel as a community, and one of the reasons for the existence of ADC is this sense of hostility between the United States, the dominant culture of the United States, and the Arab world, which is evidenced in the media, in schools, and so on and so forth. I don't need to talk to you about that. You all know it from your own experience. We're still an ethnic community, racially profiled, singled out for a particular form of hostile attention. So I think this gives our situation its peculiar identity. And that's what I want to talk about, especially today, and both the challenges and the realities of that. And I want to begin by mentioning to you something which my father told me when I first came to this country. I was 15. My father had come to America in 1911 from Jerusalem. He had escaped Jerusalem because he was about to be drafted into the Ottoman army to fight in Bulgaria. So his father said to him, you know, there's no point in your being cannon fodder for the Ottoman army, run away. So he did, and he came here. He lived in the United States for 10 years. And during that time, he served in World War I in the American Army in Europe. He served in France. But the experience of those years, my father was a very laconic man. He wasn't given to long speeches, very lapidary, laconic advice. And just before I left, I was 15 at the time, to come to boarding school here, he said to me, "Edward, I have to tell you something. When you're in the United States, try and stay away from the Arabs." Not knowing what he meant, I asked him for explanations, and his one-line explanation was, "The Arabs will always pull you down." That was the experience of most, I think, Arabs of his generation, that it was a disparate community. It wasn't a community known for its internal cohesion. And indeed, for the first 10 or 11 or maybe even 15 years that I was here, I had nothing to do with Arabs. I went to schools where there were no Arabs. And indeed, I had very little contact with them because I didn't live here. I was a student, and it's in places like the universities and colleges I went to, there were very few Arab students. So it wasn't really until the '67 war that I found myself a member of a community for the first time. And what brought us together as a community was a collective defeat, which gave us an identity in this society as the peculiar scapegoats of everything that was wrong with the world. We were the fanatics, we were the terrorists, et cetera, et cetera. And I've lived this experience, as have all of us, in one way or another. And I want to give you now just 2 or 3 little anecdotes just to give you a sense of the world I live in, which is the world of, of the university, of thought, of culture, and so on and so forth, how we look in that world. In 1980, a publisher, my publisher in New York, asked me to give him a list of novels from the Third World for translation into English. He was interested in putting together a list, in his publishing house, which was a commercial, very well-known commercial publishing house. And he said, if you could give me a list of writers from the Arab world, from Africa, elsewhere, we might consider them for publication. And I gave him a list, and at the top of the list was, this was in 1980, was Naguib Mahfouz, who at the time wasn't known in this country. 8 years later, of course, he won the Nobel Prize, and as a sign of what that meant was that in the paper that was written, the column that was written about his prize in the New York Times, the first quotation was from the Israeli consul, they had to get his idea. How do you feel about an Egyptian winning the Nobel Prize? Okay, back to 1980. I gave him the list and didn't think much about it until I ran into him a few months later, and I said to him, "Andre, what has happened to the list I gave you?" He said, "Well, we're proceeding with some of the novels you mentioned." And I said, "What about Naguib Mahfouz? He's a really great novelist. And although he's not well known, I'm sure he will be well known in time." So he said, "Well, we decided not to do it." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Arabic is a controversial language." Okay, that's the first story. The second story is about a decade later, in the early 90s. There's an organization which some of you may have heard of called PEN, P-E-N. It stands for Poets, Essayists, Novelists. And it's a worldwide organization of writers. And there's a very powerful PEN American Center. They're organized in centers in every country of the world. And PEN American Center, I was on the board of it, on the executive committee for it. And so a number of people said to me, wouldn't it be a good idea, given what you've been saying about the ignorance of the Arabs and of Arab culture? It wasn't political, it was cultural. Wouldn't it be a very good idea? I think I may have mentioned this earlier at an ADC convention, but it's worth repeating. Wouldn't it be a good idea if we had a meeting of Arab and American writers? Let's say we'll bring 15 or 20 writers from the Arab world. We'll get 15 or 20 prominent writers from America, people like Norman Mailer and William Styron and so on and so forth. And we would have a series of exchanges, seminars, meetings, public readings, and so on and so forth. I thought it was a great idea. And we immediately began to put together a committee, of which I was a member. And then there was a bit of a delay. And one of the delays was they were trying to decide on, I'm saying things that will sound to you shocking, but they were actually said in meetings. They were looking for a Jewish member of the committee. So I said, I mean, why is that an issue? I mean, why should there be a Jewish member of the committee? And they said, well, Edward, you understand. And I said, well, what does that have to do with Arab writers? I mean, if you were going to have an exchange between Israeli writers and American writers, you wouldn't think of putting an Arab on the committee, would you? They said, no. So I said, well, why in this case? So they said, well, it's a different situation. You understand, we have a constituency. We don't want to offend anybody. So I said, all right, fine, we'll get. So they found somebody who seemed to be interested in the idea. But the point about it is that we tried to raise money for it. The budget was fairly small. I mean, it was like $100,000 for a week-long conference involving lots of travel and writers and so on. It was impossible to do anything. And this project is still on the books at Penn, and nobody wants to support it. Neither the membership of Penn, nor in the society, where one of the organizers told me, you know, if this was a conference like the one you mentioned of Israeli and American writers, we could raise the money with one phone call. But we can't do it because there is no constituency for Arab culture in this country. So that's the second point I wanted to make, by way of a little anecdote to give you an idea of where we are. And the third, it's not exactly a story, but it's a fact that we feel as Arabs extremely uncomfortable when common and ordinary words have been associated with things that make us deeply troubled. Take the word peace, for instance. It's been hijacked. It means something quite different than it does for us in connection with the Middle East. Take the word fanaticism and violence and terrorism. Ask anybody. There was a survey done a few years ago in Canada where the word Palestinian was, you know, flashed, and the person taking the test was asked to immediately say what came into his mind. In about 80% of the cases, Palestinian triggered the word terrorism. Fanaticism, violence, etc., always associated with the Arabs, with Islam, and so on and so forth. I think that's, despite the efforts, very important efforts of ADC to sensitize people to that, it's still the case that stupid films like The Siege were made last year, and that apparently, I read Ali Abu Nami put it out on the internet, there's a new film coming out where, well, sort of like that Schwarzenegger film where he kills 80 Arabs in 2 frames or something. Arabs are always being killed. They're always associated publicly in the public mind, in the public image, with what is negative and regressive. I think that's the general situation, and it raises the question is, for the agenda, what can be done collectively as a community, among others here, to change that, not just by reacting to a terrible film or a stereotype that we might see in a comic or an advertisement or a sitcom, but over a long period of time. I mean, what is the agenda that we should put for ourselves over the next 10 or 15 years? Given that, A, that we are members of this community here, we're members of this society, Arab Americans, as Americans, and we have a real continuing connection with the Arab world, which is very important to most of us. All of us travel there, most of us travel there. We have historical connections, we have family connections, and of course we have cultural and linguistic connections. So the question is, what are the models for activism? What are the possible models for activism as Arab Americans, given this background, which I tried to sketch in? It simplifies it somewhat, but in general, I think it rings true. And given also, and this is perhaps the most important point, that we are moved by notions of citizenship. We belong here. We are American citizens, and therefore we are participating in a society, and that we have to have a say in what kind of a society this is, what sort of policy it's going to have towards the world, what kind of country this is, where its relations with the Arab world are both very important, very rich, very tense, and have been problematic for a long time. It's a daunting challenge, but I think we have to face it. And what I'm going to propose in a very sketchy way are a few ideas that may be of help, perhaps not, but are worth, in my opinion, thinking about and discussing. Now, I think the first point I'd like to make is I think it's very important to have done what we have so far done, namely to combat stereotypes, that Arabs are not simply terrorists, towel heads, camel jockeys, the whole thing. I mean, I grew up with them. Ironically, my children, a generation after me, also went to American schools, also grew up with them. So they're still there. I think it's important to combat them, but I think the next step is the one I don't think we've taken, and that is to give our culture, our heritage, our language, a real presence beyond stereotypes in this culture, in this society, in this country. Now what that means is, I think a number of things. I mean, it's important, of course, that we continue with meetings, haflis and dabkis and associations, Ramallah, Beit Hanina, Lebanese Federation, all of those, you might say, partial or local associations are terribly important. They're organic. But beyond that, it seems to me we have a terribly important responsibility towards making the contribution of our culture, which is really quite fantastic if you take the time to look at it, make it felt in, let's say, the curriculum, in the academy, in the university, in the school. I can guarantee you, and this is again something from personal experience, that I travel all over the country giving talks and so on, and everywhere I go people say, could you give us the name of a book that tells us something about the Arabs? We know nothing about them. We are, for whatever reason, excluded from, for instance, every major university in this country has a program in medieval studies. Medieval studies means, Dante, it means Chaucer, it means the founding of the university, the founding of the scholastic tradition, etc., etc. It's always assumed to mean medieval West. But the fact is, I mean, this is not something that we could even debate, this is a fact, that the medieval West is incomprehensible without Arab and Islamic civilization. There's a book, wait, it's important. There's a book, I'll give you an example. This is something that I have just learned, and I feel myself I'm sort of confessing to a tremendous lack in my own awareness. There's a very important book by an Arab-American professor at the University of Pennsylvania called George Makdisi. Some of you may know him. I think he's retired now, but he was a student of Louis Massignon, a great French Orientalist. And his book is entitled something like How Western Humanism in the West, how humanism in the West came from the Islamic world. And it's a massive tome in which he shows that the previous notion held by people like Jakob Burckhardt, the great Swiss historian of the Renaissance, who wrote at the end of the 19th century. He was a colleague of Nietzsche's at the University of Basel. And many of you may have read his book, The Origins of the Renaissance. It's a study of how the Renaissance arose in Italy in the 15th century, how people like Pico della Mirandola, Ficino, Aretino, Sir Thomas More in England, all of these people were influenced by these amazing Italian humanists who discovered the heritage, really, of ancient Greece. And the way he describes it, Burckhardt and the others, Christeller, there's a whole series of important historians, it's as if it was like the major breakthrough self-generated by these Western Italian humanists. Makdisi, of course, who knows all of the languages, not only of course, Arabic, but also Italian and Latin and Greek and so on and so forth, in a very painstaking way shows that the whole concept of humanism, the whole idea of the university as a place where discussion, disputation, argument, what was called in the late Middle Ages studia adabiyya, was in fact the invention of the Arabs. And that what we know today as humanism was in fact invented by Arabs in Sicily, in the great courts of Sicily, of Andalusia, Baghdad, etc. That there is a direct link between our culture and the modern culture of the West, which is always represented as having sprung, like from the head of Zeus, like Athena coming out, whereas in fact there is this incredible role that the Arabs have played, which is totally unknown to students, all of whom study in American universities, who study the Renaissance as the first great step in modernization, of liberal education, humanistic interpretation, and so on and so forth. There's a massive precedent for that in the world. Now, who is looking into that? I mean, this is our role, you see. This is what I'm trying to say. And beyond stereotypes, beyond saying we object to being characterized as camel jockeys or terrorists, we have to now start to put in place precisely what it is that we are. And you can't do that by just saying, well, we have a very rich civilization, or oh, the Arabs, you know, people used to say that Shakespeare was an Arab, really, Sheikh Isbir or something. I mean, that's no good. We live, or, you know, how many Spanish words are really Arabic words? Al-manakh, almanac, al-zaytun, olives, and so on, al-zaytun, and so on. Fine, that's all very nice, but that's folklore. What I'm talking about is something that every community in this country, whether it's the Asian American community, the Afro-American community, has done, is the discovery, the articulation, and the insertion of this culture into the main culture of the United States. We have not done this. We are irresponsible in the extreme when it comes to looking at the curricula of universities. And we cannot do it unless we do it ourselves. In other words, I think we owe ourselves the responsibility, to transact the responsibility of acquainting ourselves at whatever level. I'm not just talking about kids. I'm talking about seniors like myself, like many of the people here, to understand what our heritage is and to actively promote it, its literature, its language, and so on, in the society, in whatever form that is possible, whether it's the YMCA, the Rotary Club, the university, the school, etc. As I say, every ethnic community in this country, every cultural community in this country has done this, except the Arabs. It cannot be done, however, without collective will. It can't be done by individuals. Of course, individuals do it. In Houston, for instance, I was down there a couple of years ago, or maybe it was last year, giving a lecture, and I discovered that they were starting to do it. What did they do? They organized themselves, and there again, overcame the differences between Lebanese and Palestinians and Syrians and Christians and Muslims, etc., identified themselves as Arabs, established a foundation, raised money, and established a professorship in Rice University, which exactly promoted the study of the Middle East, and so on. I mean, I think this is a very, very important precedent to do this, where the culture at large, in a sense, has no place for us at present, largely because we ourselves don't do it. But I was thinking also, I wrote an article at the time of the Gulf War, where most people felt, I mean, you know, I have no, as everybody knows here, I have no love at all, and I despise Saddam Hussein and everything he represents. But Iraq is not, I mean, Iraq is not a desert country. I mean, Iraq is the richest of all Arab countries in terms of its heritage, its culture, etc. Its human and natural resources. But at the time, I remember that one of the justifications for bombing Iraq and for continuing to bomb it today is that it's basically an arid country. There's nothing there. They're just a bunch of crazy people running around, and it doesn't matter. So I wrote an article about what I called embargoed literature, how little was known in the society about novels, about poetry, about film. All of this is something that can be done at the community level, where our literature, which needs to be translated, I would say of all the major literatures in the world today, Arabic is the least translated into English. French is better, more translations into French than into English. But English, we are non-existent, largely because the community hasn't made that an imperative of its presence in this country. And that's part of citizenship. The same is true of film, the same is true of painting, the same is true of drama. One hears, there are people in this room here who have talked to me about projects to bring painting and photography and so on and so forth. This is, I mean, fantastically important, because this is, after all, a democracy. It's not a police state. So the only way, I mean, for example, our traditional enemies in the society, the Zionists, that's how they've done it. They represent in the society a positive valence, positive value, which is that, you know, that Israel, for example, and its cause is liberal, democratic, and so on and so forth. There are Israeli writers, there are Israeli speeches, there are Israeli artists, etc., all the time circulating, and very little of ours is known. And I think that is, I would say, the number one prerogative, I think, for the future, is to set Arab culture by our own efforts in the contemporary culture of this country. The second aspect of this cultural thing is to intervene actively in discussions and ADC has pioneered this, I think, that whenever there's, there's some discussion or some reporting, the example, he's not here, so he won't be embarrassed by my singling him out. There's a young man at the University of Chicago, Ali Abu Ni'mi, who's the most extraordinary surveyor of the press I've ever seen in my life. He seems to do nothing but read all the newspapers, listen to all the news broadcasts, the television thing, and he's constantly on the internet bombarding them with letters about their inaccuracies, the stupidity of the biases, and so on and so forth. We have to do that. If we don't do it, nobody else will. And as a result, we go, sort of by default, which is a situation I think that can't be allowed to continue. So I think the critical intervention on the part of individuals and associations is terribly important to keep reminding the world, not in a narcissistic or ethnocentric way, that we are a real people with a real culture and that we have something very important to contribute, both historically and at present. We have very gifted writers, movie makers, photographers, poets, etc. These are extraordinarily important. The second, the first is the cultural, and I'll try to go a little faster. The second is the political. That is to say, whether we like it or not. And I have always been aware of this from the moment I came to this country, that you always had a choice. You could either become an American and sort of forget your past. There was a teacher I had in boarding school. Allow me to tell this story. I was very homesick. I was 15. I'd never left home before. I went to this boarding school in northern New England, and I was told by a friend in Cairo that there was a teacher at that school who was originally from Egypt. I think he may have been Shami, some kind of Lebanese or something. So I was incredibly Lebanese or Palestinian. No, Shami in the Arabic, in the Egyptian sense of the word. Anyway, so I was very, يعني بلاد الشام. So I went to see him. The second day I was there, extremely, kind of timid, homesick, paralyzed boy. And I go stumbling around and I find him in his house. And I said to him, my name is Edward Said, I'm from Cairo, and so, friend of yours who was a classmate of yours at AUC told me to look you up. And he said, oh yeah. That's all he said, is, oh yeah. So I said to him, then I switched to Arabic and I started to talk to him in Arabic. And I said, I've just arrived from Egypt. And he told me to look you up and that you would assist. And he stopped me right in the middle of my sentence. He said, in English, he said, I don't speak Arabic anymore. Brother, brother. Ya akhi, he meant to say, but he said it in English. He said, brother, this is America. We have to be Americans. And then I realized that there were really two choices, right? You could be American, which meant, in his sense of the word, to just obliterate your past and be more loyalist and royalist than the king. If we're bombing somebody, we have to be more loud about bombing it than anyone else. And the whole thing. Or you could be who you really are and be both. You could be an Arab and you could be an American, somehow involving yourself on both levels. And given the politicized nature of this society, I think really, certainly all the people in this room must have chosen the second. They're here because they admit and identify with their Arab past and their Arab heritage. So I think there's a kind of a double mission politically. One is to enter public life in this country, part of the debate. As Arab Americans, you can admit it or not if you like, but certainly at some point, your name and perhaps your accent and your interests will identify you to enter public life on issues that we have in common with many Americans. Civil rights. I mean, I think Arabs are naturally progressive, despite evidence to the contrary. Some evidence to the contrary. I think given our past and the sorry situation of the Arab world today, where the whole issue of human rights and freedom of expression and, one thing or another, the Arab world is not a model for us now. So can we be a model for the Arab world? By identifying ourselves in this country with the progressive elements in the women's movement, in the civil rights movement, in the environmental movement, all of these things that are part of improving this country. It's not America right or wrong. My father used to tell me this all the time. We had a big quarrel about Vietnam. And he said, you know, my country, right or wrong. I said, Vietnam is an imperialist, murderous war. He said, yes, but your country, right or wrong. And I said, I can't agree with that. The whole idea is to challenge the rule of this country and insert your own values, which are, I think, correct ones. And I think, therefore, we have to enter into the public discussion of this country to shape this country, to turn it into an America that we can identify with and can live in as Arab Americans with respect for our background, language, religion, and so on and so forth. And of course there, until today, it is the Palestinian issue that defines the terms of debate for Arabs in this country. It doesn't mean that every Arab here has to be a partisan of Palestine. But it does mean that the central foreign policy issues between the Arab world and the United States, which affects every Arab here, is Palestine. And the issue of Palestine, because it is such a glaring case of injustice, is generally avoided in public discussions. People, you know, Tom Hayden will go on at great length correctly about how terrible the war in Kosovo is and how he's against ethnic cleansing. Who isn't against it? Everybody's against it. But nobody mentions Israel, that Israel was based on ethnic cleansing. So I think it's terribly important to enter debate in here and associate ourselves with the positive, progressive element in this country, not the neoconservative movement, not the anti-civil rights movement, not the imperialist war movement. I'm thinking of people like John McCain, who wants to bomb and invade, et cetera, but rather those currents and movements in this country that will help us. Why will it help us? And this is a very important point. And the second point I want to make, because this fight to improve the world we live in is not only being fought in this country by Americans, Arab American, Asian American, African American, et cetera, it's also being fought in the Arab world. That is to say, if you look at every country, look beneath the cliches and the lazy reporting of the media, about which I could talk to you at great length at some other time. But what is not reported about our part of the world is the fact that there is a dialectic, there's a dynamic of struggle inside the Arab world to improve the situation, for example, for human rights. I mean, there's an awareness in every Arab country now that if you go to prison, and most Arab countries are, of course, police states of one sort or another, that you are threatened immediately with torture. It's important to say, of course, that Israel is the only country in the world that legalizes torture. But at least, maybe that's a positive step. At least they've come out and said, yes, we're allowing torture and we want to make a law, pass a law that says that we can't torture. Maybe we can improve the situation in the Arab world where Arab countries and Arab states pass laws saying that we want to torture too. But at least we have to take a position on it, you see. There are now several important Arab human rights groups in the Arab world. There are now quite militant struggles going on within the Arab press, which is heavily censored, not only, you know, in the obvious places, but in liberal countries, essentially liberal countries like Egypt, which has extremely regressive press laws. Jordan as well. Jordan in this country enjoys a reputation for a liberal democracy and so on and so forth. But the fact is that when it comes to the press law in Jordan is fantastically regressive. It's simply unacceptable. And alas, the same thing is true of the Palestinian press laws. Freedom of expression. Look what it's done to the universities. Universities in the Arab world today are a disgrace because they're essentially political institutions. You cannot advance, get promoted. If you take positions that are unpopular, that are unorthodox, you have to be very safe, very careful in order to please the party, please the ruler, please your colleagues who might report on you. There's no scientific research to speak of. There's no freedom of inquiry. Well, that's an important struggle that could involve us. Many of us are academics. Many of us are involved in issues of that sort in this country. And I think we ought to also be able to identify with similar struggles within the Arab world, the women's movement, the environmental movement. There's now, I mean, if you think of how single-handedly the Arab world has destroyed its natural environment. I mean, think of the sea off the Syrian, Lebanese, Palestinian, Egyptian coast. It's dead by virtue of pesticides, bombing, dynamiting fish, etc., etc., etc. to say nothing of what's happening in the landscape and so on and so forth. Well, there are groups beginning to emerge in the Arab world, and I think it's with those that we have to identify as part of our struggle as Arab Americans here to do the same thing, but also there because of this double connection that we have. So the main point I want to make, therefore, is that our participation in the political agenda, in the forming of a political agenda, a cultural agenda, for Arab Americans is an inclusive one. It cannot be simply based upon what I have called folklore, and simply going back to having, you know, haflis and simply trying to attack and criticize negative stereotypes. I think, just to resume it quickly, to put in place a program designed to place Arab culture at the apex, at the heart of the humanistic, scientific, cultural, and political traditions of the world. It is a world culture which has contributed a tremendous amount, and the only people who can do it are people who are relatively free to do it, namely those of us here in this country. That's number one. Number two, intervene actively in the political issues of this country. And third, intervene politically in a similar way, and whether it's the question of Palestine, whether it's the question of human rights, against torture, all of these things. I think in the Arab world these struggles are going on, but they're also going on in this country, which is in many ways deeply repressive. This country has the largest prison population per member of the per capita of any country in the world. I mean, there are many abuses, and we should not be afraid to speak out and to take prominent positions, as many of our community already has. People like Ralph Nader, who doesn't particularly want to identify with the Arabs, but everybody knows he's an Arab. You know, maybe he doesn't know it, but. Anyway, I just want to conclude by, since I have to say something about it. This is the last thing I want to say, which is has nothing to do with the subject at hand, which is a political agenda, etc. It is. I just want to say one word or two, maybe, about the Kosovo thing, which has been very much on my mind, and a lot of we've been silent on this, and there are reports in the Arab world that people are happy and that the Emirates have sent tents and hospitals, and of course the Israelis have sent, and we identify with the Kosovars and the Albanians, and it's a kind of confused thing. But I think it's very important for Arab Americans to remember a couple of things. Number one, that the United States, which is a country we pay taxes in, we elect officials, mistakenly in some cases, to lead this country, we have a responsibility for the image of this country in the world as citizens of it. And we now live in a country which is the only world-class bully which bombs at will all around the world. Now, it's not an accident, and I think you mustn't be fooled. You mustn't be fooled by this nonsense about humanitarian intervention. I mean, there have been interventions that the United States has blocked. Rwanda in 1995. The United States simply refused to enter into this at all. Chief United States ally, Turkey, is massacring Kurds. 46,000 have been killed. The United States is leading today a genocidal assault on the Iraqi people. The United States, with Britain, you know, when you say you want to intervene in a humanitarian way, you have to make sure that the intervention isn't going to make matters worse. Well, in Yugoslavia it did. They destroyed the country. They created, I mean, of course there was ethnic cleansing by the Serbs. But it's difficult to tell, and if you ask any honest reporters, not that there are that many around, but if you ask reporters, how much evidence do we have of ethnic cleansing by Serb paramilitaries and militaries? The evidence is very unclear. Very few people have actually seen it. I'm sure there was a lot of it, but there's no question also that the million-plus refugees that have been created, largely as a result of the illegal bombing by NATO, which, and to come back to the United States, two other points to come back to the United States. This is an unconstitutional, illegal war. He didn't get approval from the Congress. He was supposed to have gotten it by May the 25th. And, of course, if we are against ethnic cleansing, we have to go back to the first important ethnic cleansing in the post-World War II period, namely Palestine. So it seems to me it's very clear. Clinton, and there are movements in this country. You see, the press hasn't reported the protest against the war in this country, nor in Greece, nor in Italy, nor in Germany, nor in France, nor in England. There's been, I mean, the worst performance of the press is, I think, the last, everyone is the worst, but this is, you know, getting out of control. But the point I want to make is that according to the terms of the International Tribunal for Yugoslavia that has indicted Milosevic as a war criminal, can, in my opinion, and will never have credibility unless it does, also indict Clinton as a war criminal. And there is as much of what he did in Iraq, and remember the bombing of Sudan. I mean, he has now admitted that there was absolutely no evidence for what they did last August, the bombing of that factory. Of course, there has been a meningitis epidemic in Sudan, and many of the medications used to come from the Shifa, whatever his name is, company, which U.S. bombers destroyed as they destroyed encampments, killed several Pakistanis in Afghanistan. So this is a lawless, in my opinion, a lawless regime, which as Arab Americans, as people who have a real stake in the meaning of ethnic cleansing and the restitution of refugees to their homes, we have to speak out as a community. And it won't do simply to say, well, it's really not my field of expertise. Anyone can read up on it and see what's being done. But it's in that spirit of activism and intervention, as exemplified, I just would like to conclude on this note, as exemplified by our late friend who recently died, whose memory I'd like to honor for a minute here, Iqbal Ahmed, where it doesn't matter whether you're a Pakistani or an Indian or a Bangladeshi or a Turk or a Kurd or an Arab or French, you are a citizen of the world. And we, as Arabs and as Americans, we oppose injustice. We are totally opposed to the kind of suffering that our country is imposing on the world by its barbaric foreign, criminal, gangster foreign policy. And I think that's part of our agenda for the future. Thank you.
I'm going to make a very unusual, extraordinary act of sacrifice. I shall abandon my comments for your questions.
I'd be happy to answer questions, or there's a microphone there. Probably another one.
Dr. Saeed, I'm Sandy Sabah from Bloomington, Indiana. We heard in the Gulf War that the agenda was New World Order, and we know it was an oil situation. What is the real agenda of our government in Kosovo? Certainly not what it's spoken to be.
Well, all the evidence that we have suggests that there were a number of pressures, very little to do in the end, I think, with ethnic cleansing and humanitarian intervention. I think you have to remember that this is an administration that has been saying for as long as it's been there, since Clinton came to power in '92, that we have to enlarge the sphere of democracy in order for there to be bigger markets for American exports. I think there's no question that to turn Europe, what's going on? I think there's no question that to turn Europe into a stable zone is very important for the American vision of globalization and economic domination. That's number one. Number two, a great part has been played in all the information I've seen about this. A great part has been played in this by bumbling, internecine fighting within the administration, the conflict between William Cohen and Mrs. Partbright, whatever her name is, Madeleine Albright. You know, the idea that we have an army, we have to use it, the pressure of the military industrial complex. The United States, I think it's very important for us to understand that the United States military budget is 30% higher than the entire military budget of NATO. So this has got to go someplace. As Madeleine Albright once said to Colin Powell, what's the good of having a big army if you don't use it? So there's that. There's the testing, as there was in the Gulf War, of smart bombs. You know, every generation of armament. There's that. There's also the fact that this is a neoliberal group. I mean, people like both Blair, or rather Clinton and puppy dog Blair, are men who never fought, who are anti-Vietnam War opponents, you remember, in the 60s and 70s. And for them, this is a liberal war. This is the war which is, most of the left in this country has supported it as intervention, humanitarian intervention. Whereas, in fact, it is the assertion of American power. It is the notion that American power can shape the world. We have to stand tall. All of these things went into it, I believe, and have made it an attractive, on the surface, an attractive policy. But it's falling apart. I mean, of course, nobody's thought is what's going to happen. I mean, now he says, the other day, Clinton says, unless they get rid of Milosevic, we're not going to help them rebuild. The bill for the destruction of Yugoslavia is conservatively estimated at $136 billion. So we destroyed a country. Well, I mean, there are many economic opportunities there also. You have to think of it that way. There is the assertion of American power, the ability to fight regional wars, more than one at a time, Iraq, Yugoslavia, who knows, maybe someplace in Central America next, one doesn't know. So I think all of that is part of it, but the least convincing argument is humanitarian intervention. I mean, that has no role in the thing at all. It's nonsense, in my opinion. Yes?
Dr. Edward Said, أنا مو شامي, أنا فلسطيني.
No, I meant Shami in the general sense. You don't know. You're too young to know these things.
I'm kidding. Yeah. Would you comment on two areas which we are not in as Arab Americans and which will determine our future in this country? Two areas where we're not in. One is the political arena in Congress and in the Senate. The representatives of Arab Americans are 1% of Arab Americans in both houses, as opposed to 43% who are of Jewish origin. So 1% to 43%, and yet our statistical base is about 5 million to 6 million. So this is one area. And the second area is the area of entertainment and media. We are totally non-existent in media. And until we learn to control or penetrate media or films, I have a great respect for a personal friend of mine who has done 13 films in this country, Mustafa Al-Aqad, who is a person I admire a lot. Wow. And all of them are about Halloween and Friday the 13th. Nothing that...
Yeah, that's a very good point. I take your point. I think you're absolutely right. But, yes, of course, yes.
And then one final request, and that is a prayer. Why don't we start and end our conventions with a word to God to bless us, since we gave religion to both Islam and Christianity? Why can't we do that?
Well, I don't know. I'm not the organizer of this convention, and it's a good thing I'm not, because I wouldn't invite myself here. But anyway, to come back to your two main questions, leaving the prayer aside, which is not my field, that is the political and media absence. You see, but they're part of what I was talking about earlier. Generally speaking, we tend to be underrepresented in these sensitive areas relative to our population. Why? I think, I mean, you know, there's a speculation here. I think most first-generation immigrants to this country, especially from the Arab world, tend to be non-political, tend to be professionally oriented. I mean, they tend to go into things like business or medicine or engineering or that sort of thing. And because, the third reason, I think they don't have enough of the kind of cultural background formation, which I was talking about, which is absent from our education today, where we are so anxious to become assimilated Americans that we forget the importance of bringing in our own background and our own history into it. So I think it's all part of the same thing, that you don't think of yourself as part of the media working as an Arab. You may want to get in the media, but you don't want to do it in the way that you mentioned. Akkad being the perfect example that you mentioned. See, he's on his own. He's not part of a community effort to represent and give prominence to a community which is a national community. The same applies to politics. Now, there are efforts being made. Zoghbi is doing it with his political institute, or whatever it's called, where he's trying to get Arabs involved in voter registration and so on and so forth. They're like the early efforts of the African-American community. But I think on its own it can't work. It has to be part of a much larger based collective organizing, which really starts with a school, and where there's a kind of consciousness of one's own background and what one can bring to it, A, and B, a deeper understanding of the way this country works. Generally speaking, you know, I used to be amazed. You'd go to places, when I first came to this country, I'd go to Brooklyn and visit friends like Leila Haddad, whom I saw here. And I met somebody there who'd lived in Brooklyn for 40 years, didn't know a word of English. We tend to be enclosed in our own. So one has to understand the way the system works, I think, to understand the importance of what you've mentioned, the media, which is central. But media includes broadcasting, it includes writing, editing, publishing, filmmaking. I mean, there's so many, acting, and so on and so forth. So it's a large and complicated thing, and we're very early in this game. But I think we're getting there. I mean, I was amazed, because my daughter's trying to be an actress. I was amazed asking friends how many Arabs there are in Hollywood. There are quite a few. But they're there, you know, sort of, you know, as actresses or producers or directors. Each one is by himself. There isn't a sense that they're part of a community trying to do something together. But perhaps in time that'll develop if organizations like this develop also.
Professor Saeed, we
Sir.
have another line here.
Yes,
for
of
you.
course you do. I've got 5 minutes, and I've got to run. I've got to catch a plane. Yeah.
Very quick.
Very quick.
We are approaching election year,
Right.
as you know, in this country.
Right.
And there has been a change in Israel, in occupied Palestine,
All right. Right.
with the new premier. Considering Gore will win, and
I'm not sure he
I am
will.
sure you are aware of his background
Yes, of course.
with the Hasidic movement and the fanatic Zionist movements,
And Martin Peretz.
and his
also.
grandfather too.
Yes.
And I would like you to enlighten us about what things hide to us. The only status quo we have is the stability of the PLA. The change is happening in America and in Israel. And the great stability of non-democracy and non-freedom of speech in the West, still occupied West Bank
Yes.
and Gaza.
Right.
Please elaborate. Thank you.
Well, very quickly, I mean, first of all, I don't think it's a foregone conclusion that Gore will win the election. But I take your point about his being, you know, probably worse than Clinton. I think we're fooling ourselves to believe that the situation is now one that we can really influence. I think the situation in Israel, given the new election of Barak, there's been a lot of euphoria expressed about, you know, what a wonderful change and so on. In many ways, I think he's probably worse than Netanyahu, because like Netanyahu, he's an Arab killer. I mean, that's his whole career. You saw what he did with the 10 Arab. There are now 10 or 12 Arab parties in the Knesset. He simply ignored them in talking about, you know, the future. I think he's a hardliner. I mean, his whole political discourse was such. I think also the kind of lamentable, I don't know whether it's stupidity or slavishness, fawning, servility of the Palestinian Authority in welcoming Barak, and how this is a great moment for peace and all this kind of, it's complete bullshit. Now, I don't think much can be, I mean, really, to give you the short answer to your question, I don't think we can do much as a community in the next election, whether as a result of the Israeli election or the American election. But what we can do is, A, try to educate our people to a better, that's something I missed out entirely in talking about. But as a community who lives here, it's our duty to explain to people in the Arab world what this country really is about. You know, I mean, when leaders come here and all they want to do is to sit in the White House and be photographed next to Clinton and talk to, I mean, that's not what it's about. We've never tried to do what we need to do, which is to organize a massive human rights campaign in this country, for example, for Palestinian rights. Never did that. I think that's number one. Number two, we have to make sure that, that institutions in Palestine and in the Arab world, non-governmental institutions, which are threatened by the Palestinian Authority, which are threatened by the Egyptian government, which has passed a very repressive law against NGOs, that these civil institutions are strengthened despite the efforts of the governments, various governments, to stifle them. And above all, to try to promote discussion and open exchange within the Arab context to talk about the future in some meaningful way, as opposed to just running after the United States. The United States is not the solution of our problem. It is our problem, as Arabs and as Americans. And more and more of the world, more and more of the world is recognizing it. And it's quite stunning, as a result of this Kosovo thing, how many commentators on the right-wing commentators like Safar, Rosenthal, etc., are beginning to realize that the United States has really played itself a very bad role by turning itself into the world's biggest bully, and anti-Americanism is on the rise. Everybody's aware that this is a country that can't lead. But we haven't devised, especially in the Arab world, we haven't devised a system, a method for dealing with the United States. And I think that's important for people like us. I think
Well, let me, in a very nonpartisan way, say, "O Lord, thank you for the grace that has made the ADC convention this year the most successful convention. Let us also hope that Edward Said will be able to continue his struggle, not only for the human rights of all, not only for the cultural integrity, not only for his dynamic intervention into civilized discourse, but also hope that he would have the full health to undertake the intellectual revolution which would deliver for us Palestine and Jerusalem as its capital." Mazen, Adnan, Naila, Hala, members of the board and members of ADC, congratulations. Good day.
In a minute, a portion of yesterday's House Rules Committee meeting on juvenile crime.